The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Eliza Hawthorne buried the last of her savings in a coffee tin behind the boarding house and decided that desperation, like the Arizona summer, was something a woman either survived or didn't. She had been in Tucson for 3 months, having come down from Missouri after her father's death left her with nothing but a medical satchel, a stubborn education she'd earned at the knee of Dr. Samuel Hawthorne, and a reputation in Hannibal that a woman who knew anatomy and medicine was either a saint or a scandal, depending on who you asked. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, with hands that had set bones and lanced infections and held dying men's hands through their last hours, and she had decided a long time ago that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. The telegram read, "Seeking experienced nurse for dying rancher. Generous pay. Travel provided. Reply to HAYES Deputy Sheriff, Copper Bend, Arizona Territory. 1882. It was October of 1882. The land was bone dry and burning, and Eliza read the telegram twice before folding it into the pocket of her gray dress and walking to the telegraph office to send her reply. She arrived in Copper Bend 2 days later on the back of a mail coach that smelled like horse sweat and old leather, and Deputy Sheriff Marcus Hayes met her at the station with his hat in his hands and an expression of profound relief that bordered on worship. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, extending his hand, which she shook with the firm grip that always surprised men who expected something limp and apologetic. "I am very glad you came. We have been through 3 nurses in 6 weeks. 3, she repeated. The first quit after 4 days, said the patient was impossible. The second lasted a week. The third left in the middle of the night, and we are not entirely certain what frightened her off." Eliza looked at the town around her, a main street of packed earth, a general store, a saloon, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though weary of its own righteousness, and beyond it all, the vast red and amber sweep of Arizona Territory, brutal and gorgeous and indifferent to human suffering. "Tell me about the patient," she said. Hayes put his hat back on and gestured toward a wagon. "His name is Grant Conroy. He is 32 years old and he owns the Conroy Ranch, which is the largest cattle operation in this part of the territory. 3 months ago he took a bad fall from his horse during a storm, broke 2 ribs, punctured a lung, and developed a fever that nearly killed him outright. The fever broke but left him weak as a newborn foal. The doctor in town says without proper nursing care and rest, the lung could go again. He needs someone to manage his medication, his meals, make sure he doesn't do something stupid and tear himself open worse. And the difficulty," Eliza said, "is not the injury, it is the patient." Hayes had the grace to look slightly pained. "Grant Conroy is not what you would call an easy man. I have nursed difficult men before, Deputy Hayes." "Yes, ma'am." "But Grant Conroy is a particular kind of difficult." He helped her up onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her, clicking to the horses. "He does not believe he is dying. He does not believe he needs help. He has thrown a perfectly good bowl of soup at his ranch hand, refused his medication 3 times this week, and told the last nurse that he would sooner be buried alive than spend another day being clucked over like a sick hen." "I see," said Eliza. "The thing of it is," Hayes continued, guiding the wagon out of town and onto the red dirt road that wound through scrub brush and saguaro toward the distant outline of a ranch, "if he doesn't get proper care, he will die. Doctor Pemberton is certain of it. The lung is fragile right now. One bad exertion, one more fever, and it will collapse completely." Eliza looked out at the desert. The sky was enormous and achingly blue, the kind of sky that made a person feel simultaneously insignificant and alive. "And he knows this?" she asked. "He knows it. He simply doesn't care to let it slow him down." "How long has he been running the ranch alone?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "His father died 8 years ago, left him the land when Grant was 24. He has been running it ever since. His mother passed 2 years after that. No siblings. No wife." Another pause. "He is not a man accustomed to needing anybody." Eliza tucked that information away the way she tucked away all useful information, neatly and without sentiment. It told her more about the patient than any medical history could. A man who had built himself out of necessity, who had learned that depending on others was a prelude to loss. She had treated men like that before. They were, in her experience, the most difficult patients and also, underneath the armor, the most afraid. The Conroy Ranch appeared around a bend in the road like something out of a painting, a wide, low house of pale adobe and rough timber, a large barn the color of dried blood, several outbuildings, corrals full of horses and cattle, the whole thing backed by a ridge of copper-colored rock that gave the town its name. It was, she had to admit, a remarkable piece of land. Well tended despite everything, which told her that the man running it refused to let his illness touch what he'd built, even if it was killing him in the process. A young man of about 20 with sun-darkened skin and a worried expression met them in the yard. He introduced himself as Pablo Reyes, the ranch hand Hayes had mentioned, and he looked at Eliza with the particular combination of hope and pity that told her he had watched his employer deteriorate and was running out of ideas. "He is not having a good morning," Pablo said quietly as he took their bags. "He tried to get up at dawn to check on the east pasture fence, and I had to persuade him otherwise." "Persuade him how?" Eliza asked. "I told him one of the horses had kicked a hole in the barn wall and needed immediate attention, and that I could not handle it alone." "Was there a hole?" "There is now," Pablo said, with the expression of a man who had made his peace with creative problem-solving. Eliza allowed herself a brief, private smile and followed Hayes into the house. The main room was large and simply furnished, all dark wood and leather and iron, the kind of room that had never had a woman's touch and had never particularly missed one. On the far wall hung a rifle and a framed map of the territory. On the table near the window was a collection of papers and ledgers that told her the man had been trying to work from his sickbed, which was exactly the wrong thing to be doing. Hayes led her down a short hallway to a bedroom, knocked once, and opened the door without waiting for an answer, which Eliza noted as a sign of either his authority or the frequency with which he was ignored. The man in the bed was not what she had expected. She had expected weakness, the particular wasting quality of prolonged illness, the sunken cheeks and brittle quality she had seen in so many patients brought low by injury and fever. And there was some of that. He was thinner than he should have been, his color not quite right, the shadows under his eyes speaking of nights fought rather than slept. But Grant Conroy was also, even prone and irritated, a substantially present man. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same copper rock that backed his property. His eyes, when they fixed on her from across the room, were a shade of gray-green that reminded her of the Missouri River in autumn, and they held in them exactly what Hayes had promised: the flat, implacable refusal of a man who had decided that this situation was not going to defeat him, because nothing was going to defeat him, and if you thought otherwise you could leave the same way the last 3 people had left. "No," he said. His voice was rough, partly from the injury and partly, she suspected, from constitutionally sounding that way. "Good morning, Mr. Conroy," Eliza said pleasantly. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard, where Pablo was already at the barn, and she took in the light and the air and the general state of the room, which was stuffy and overwarm and needed airing out immediately. "I am Eliza Hawthorne. I will be your nurse." "I don't need a nurse." She turned from the window and looked at him with the calm, measuring gaze she had perfected over years of dealing with patients who believed their own assessments of their condition. "Dr. Pemberton disagrees. I have reviewed the details of your injury. I also disagree." The last nurse cried. The one before that fainted when she saw the scar. "I'm not interested in fainting," Eliza said, and she set her medical satchel on the chair beside the bed and opened it with brisk, practiced efficiency. "I am interested in your lung function, your temperature, your current medication schedule, and why you are not taking the laudanum drops Dr. Pemberton prescribed." Silence. He watched her unpack her satchel the way a man watches something he is not sure whether to trust or throw out the window. "The laudanum makes me foggy," he said finally. "Yes, that is rather the point. You need rest to heal. The fog facilitates rest. I have a ranch to run. You have a lung that is one bad morning away from collapsing completely, which will result in you not having anything to run at all." She looked up from her satchel and met his eyes squarely. "Pablo Reyes appears to be a capable young man. I observed him handling 2 horses and a repair at the same time since I arrived. The ranch will survive a few weeks without you directing every nail and fence post." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. He had, she suspected, grown accustomed to being managed rather than spoken to directly. "You are not what I expected," he said. "People rarely are," she replied. "Now, let me examine you." He did not argue, which she marked as her first small victory. The examination told her what she needed to know. The ribs were healing slowly but correctly. The lung was the real concern, and she could hear it when she pressed the stethoscope Hayes had included in the medical kit against his chest, the faint crackling quality that spoke of tissue that had been damaged and was mending itself with great effort and insufficient rest. He also had a low-grade fever which he had not mentioned and which had not been mentioned in Hayes's summary. "You have a fever," she said. "It comes and goes." "It has been coming and going for how long?" A pause. "About a week." She straightened and looked at him with an expression that conveyed, without drama, precisely what she thought of a man who had been sitting on a persistent fever for a week without telling anyone. "The fever is your body fighting infection. Every time you exert yourself and raise your temperature further, you set the healing back. Do you understand what I am telling you? That I need to stay in bed." "That you need to stay in bed," she confirmed. "For at minimum 3 weeks, likely 4. After that, light activity only, increasing gradually. The lung needs time." He looked at the ceiling. In profile, with the morning light coming through the window she had partially opened despite the chill in the October air, because fresh air mattered more than comfort, he looked like a man at war with himself, the part that wanted to refuse everything fighting the part that understood she was right. "Fine," he said at last. It sounded like a man setting down something very heavy. "Good," said Eliza, and she began preparing his morning medication. Those first days were a careful negotiation of territory. Eliza established herself in the small bedroom across the hall with the practicality of a woman who had slept in worse places, and she set about building a routine for him with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. Medications at specific times. Meals prepared with attention to what would support healing. Pablo's cooking was serviceable, but she supplemented it with her own knowledge of what a damaged lung needed: more broth, more iron, less of the heavily salted beef jerky he kept reaching for because old habits died slowly. She opened windows every morning despite his protests that the desert air was cold in October, because stale air was the enemy of respiratory recovery. She kept careful notes in the small journal she always carried. She took his temperature twice a day and his pulse every morning, and she recorded everything with the meticulous care of someone who understood that the difference between a patient surviving and not often came down to the details no one else thought to track. He watched all of this with an expression that cycled over those first days, from suspicion to reluctant acknowledgement to something she could not quite categorize. On the 4th morning she arrived with his breakfast and his medication to find him sitting up in bed with one of the ranch ledgers spread across his knees, a pencil behind his ear, looking absolutely unrepentant. "Put it away," she said. "I need to look at the cattle numbers before the end of the month. You need to rest." "I can rest and look at numbers at the same time." "You cannot, because looking at the numbers will lead to worrying about the numbers. And worrying raises your heart rate and your blood pressure, and uses energy your body should be directing toward healing." She set the breakfast tray on the bedside table and held out her hand for the ledger. "Pablo can tell me what needs attention, and I will tell you when it is truly urgent and cannot wait." He looked at her hand, he looked at the ledger, he looked at her face. "You are extremely bossy," he said. "I prefer thorough," she replied. He handed her the ledger. She set it on the dresser across the room, out of easy reach, and handed him his medication instead. "The cattle numbers," he said, as he took the medication with better grace than the first day, "are a genuine concern. I have a buyer in Prescott who needs a count by the end of October, and Pablo is a good hand, but he is not good with paperwork. Then dictate a letter to me after your afternoon rest, and I will write it for you." "I have legible handwriting." He stared at her. "You would do that?" "I would do whatever is necessary to keep you from doing it yourself and setting your recovery back another week," she said, entirely practically, and she watched something warm and surprised pass through his gray-green eyes before he looked down at his breakfast. She had not expected, when she took this position, to find the work interesting. Not this particular work. Not a man with a punctured lung and a will like iron. She had expected to manage a straightforward recovery and collect her fee and be on her way to the next thing, which was what her life had been for 3 years now, a series of next things. No attachment, no roots, because roots were what got you hurt. But Grant Conroy was not a straightforward recovery, and he was not an uninteresting man, and she found herself, against her better judgment, engaged. He did not talk much in those early days. He was a man who had learned to communicate efficiently, in few words, because he had been alone long enough that words had lost some of their currency. But when he did speak, it was direct and without pretense, and she found she respected that. He never said anything he did not mean, and he never said things for the sake of filling silence, and in her experience that was rarer than gold. On the 6th day, during the afternoon quiet when he was supposed to be resting, and she was sitting in the chair by the window writing her notes, he said, "Where are you from?" She looked up. He was watching the ceiling with the particular look of a man who has been alone with his thoughts too long and has finally decided company might be preferable. "Missouri," she said. "Hannibal. Long way from home. It stopped being home when my father died." "Your father was a doctor. How did you guess?" "The way you handle the stethoscope like it's yours." He shifted slightly, adjusting his position against the pillows in a way that she monitored automatically for signs of pain. "Most nurses I've seen treat equipment like it belongs to someone else." She considered him for a moment. "He was a doctor, yes, country doctor mostly. He taught me everything he knew because he said there was no sense in knowing things if you didn't pass them on, and I was the only one available to receive the passing." She paused. He also believed that skill had no gender, which was not a popular opinion in Hannibal. "Popular opinions are usually boring," Grant said. She wrote another line in her notes. "What about you? Your family built this ranch." "My father built it. Came out from Texas in 1858 with $100 and more stubbornness than sense and filed a land claim before anyone else had figured out this was good cattle country." A pause. "He was right about the land. And you've been running it alone for 8 years. "Running it, yeah." "You enjoy it," she said, and it was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "There are days when I ride out to the north pasture at sunrise, and the light comes off those red rocks, and I think there is nowhere else on earth I would rather be." Another pause, shorter this time. "And there are days when I am so goddamn tired of doing everything alone that I could walk off the edge of the territory and not look back." She stopped writing and looked at him. He was still studying the ceiling, his expression unchanged, as though he had simply made an observation about the weather. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in quite some time," she said. He turned his head and looked at her then, for the first time that day, directly. "You seem like someone who prefers honest." "I do," she said, deeply. They looked at each other for a moment that was slightly longer than it needed to be, and then she returned to her notes and he returned to the ceiling, and the room settled back into its quiet. But something had shifted in it, some small degree of temperature, and she felt it the way you feel the first hint of rain in dry air, not the thing itself yet, but the unmistakable promise of it. The second week brought a change in the weather. A cold front moved down from the north, and the October desert that had been all golden heat turned sharp and gray, the wind carrying the smell of distant rain. Eliza kept the fire in Grant's room burning steady and watched the fever with close attention because cold fronts had a way of challenging recovering lungs, and she had learned the hard way in Missouri that the turning of seasons could take a patient from improving to critical in 24 hours if you weren't watching. He was improving, genuinely, tangibly improving in ways that she tracked with careful satisfaction. His temperature was down. His color was better. The crackling in his lung was less pronounced. He was sleeping through the night, which had not been the case the first week when he had woken repeatedly either from pain or from the restless energy of a man who was not built for lying still. Pablo came to her one morning with his hat in his hands and a troubled expression that had been building for a few days. "There is a situation," he said, "with the east pasture fence. Some cattle got through onto Miller land. Tom Miller is a reasonable man, but his foreman is not, and the foreman has been making noise about impoundment fees and damages." "Can you handle it?" Eliza asked. "I can handle the fence and the cattle. I cannot handle Tom Miller's foreman and his pride." Pablo looked at the door of Grant's room. Normally, Mr. Conroy would ride out there and have a conversation, and Miller's foreman would remember his manners very quickly. Eliza understood. She had observed by now that Grant Conroy's particular combination of size, directness, and reputation in this part of the territory operated as a kind of authority that did not require dramatic demonstration. He simply was the sort of man that other men did not push unless they were prepared for a serious pushback. "Tell me what needs to be said," she told Pablo. "I will tell Mr. Conroy, and he can dictate a letter with his name on it, and you can write it out to Miller's foreman." "A letter from Grant Conroy will carry the same weight as his presence." Pablo brightened. "You think that will work?" "It will work if the letter is specific enough that the foreman knows Mr. Conroy is fully aware of the details of the situation and not to be trifled with." She paused. "Bring me the details this evening." That afternoon, she sat at Grant's bedside with her pen and paper while he dictated, and she wrote. And what emerged was a letter that was brief and precise and courteous in a way that somehow made it more rather than less intimidating, because it demonstrated that he understood exactly what was happening and was giving the other party exactly one opportunity to resolve it reasonably. "Read it back," he said when she finished. She did. He listened. "You changed some of what I said," he observed. "You said, 'Tell your foreman if he impounds one of my cattle, I will ride out there, and he will regret it.' I changed it to 'I expect this matter to be resolved in a manner satisfactory to both parties and have every confidence that it will be.' The meaning is identical, and the second version is harder to argue with in front of a county judge." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're clever," he said, and the simple directness of it, unadorned by any of the usual hedging men applied to compliments directed at women, as if the compliment were also somehow embarrassing, startled her into something that was not quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. "Thank you," she said, equally simply. Pablo rode out the next morning with the letter, and returned the following afternoon with a report that Miller's foreman had read it, read it again, and then very quietly arranged for the cattle to be returned and the fence damage to be settled equitably. Grant received this news with the expression of a man who had expected nothing less, and Eliza received it with the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved correctly. On the 10th day she found him standing at the window, not sitting, standing. Fully upright in his nightshirt and bare feet, one hand braced against the window frame, looking out at the ranch yard where Pablo and two other hands she had started to recognize a tall, quiet man named Silas, and a younger Mexican boy named Rodrigo who was learning the roping trade were working with horses in the corral. "Mr. Conroy," she said. "I've been lying down for 10 days, he said, not turning around. "You have been recovering for 10 days, which requires lying down. I feel better." "You feel less terrible, which is not the same as better." She came to stand beside him and looked out the window. It was an overcast morning, and the ranch had a quiet, pewter quality, the horses steaming gently in the cool air. "Your lung is still fragile. Standing is acceptable. Standing at this window for 5 minutes twice a day is acceptable. Walking to the barn is not acceptable. Pablo is handling Ringo wrong, he said. The black mare. She's high-strung and you have to let her smell your hands before you approach, and he's walking straight at her. Eliza looked. Pablo was, indeed, approaching the black mare in a way that made the horse flatten her ears and sidestep nervously. Go back to bed and I will go tell him. He looked at her. The gray-green of his eyes in the gray morning light was something she was finding it increasingly difficult to think about in purely clinical terms. You know anything about horses? I know how to ride and I know the basics of handling. Tell me what to tell him, he told her. She went out to the corral and relayed the instructions to Pablo, who listened with serious attention and then approached the black mare differently. And the mare dropped her head and blew out a long, relaxed breath and let him take her halter. When she came back in, Grant was in bed. He had actually followed her direction without her having to chase him, which was such a notable development that she did not remark on it, simply nodded and began preparing his mid-morning medication. Her name is Ringo, she asked. My father named all his horses after outlaws. Seemed funny at the time. A pause. That mare is the last one. She was born the year my father died. I've kept her ever since because he stopped. Because she was his, Eliza said. Yeah. She handed him his medication and he took it, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the silence was one of those comfortable silences that you only achieve with someone you have somehow, without quite planning it, begun to trust. How long ago did you say your father died? He asked. 4 months ago, in June. I'm sorry. She looked at him. He said it simply, without the elaborate sympathy that people usually deployed, which was somehow worse than saying nothing because it drew attention to itself and required response. He said it the way he said most things, directly, meaning it, not asking anything back from her. Thank you, she said. It's hard, he said, to lose a father you admired. Yes, she agreed. It is. By the end of the second week, she was spending the evenings in the chair by his window more by habit than necessity. She had begun bringing her own book in the evenings, and he had taken to reading as well. He had a modest library on the shelf near his bed, mostly practical books, surveying manuals and cattle management texts, and one well-worn copy of a Dickens novel that she noted with private interest. And the evenings had taken on a quality of companionable quiet that she had not experienced in a very long time. He asked her once what she was reading. She told him it was a natural history of the Sonoran Desert that she had borrowed from Dr. Pemberton, because she preferred, when she was in a place, to understand the land she was standing on. What does it say? He asked. It says the saguaro cactus can live 200 years and store hundreds of gallons of water. It says the Tohono O'odham people have lived in this desert for thousands of years and knew things about survival here that the settlers are only beginning to understand, and that the displacement of those peoples was one of the great crimes of the territory. She looked up from the page. Does that bother you, living on land that was taken from people who were here first? He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. My father bought this land through the land office, which is legal, but what made it available to the land office is not something I can make right or pretend was right. I know a Tohono O'odham man named Miguel who lives about 8 miles east. We trade sometimes cattle in difficult years for knowledge of water sources when the dry season gets bad. I try to trade fairly. He paused. It doesn't fix the larger thing. I know that. She looked at him with the regard of someone who has tested a thing and found it not wanting. Not many ranchers would say that. Not many ranchers bother to think about it. He met her eyes briefly before looking back at his book. I've had a lot of time to think lately, apparently. She smiled at her page and he didn't see it, and she was glad, because it was the kind of smile that would have given entirely too much away. 14 days. He had been expected to require 4 weeks of strict bed rest, possibly more, and at 14 days Dr. Pemberton arrived on his weekly visit and listened to Grant's chest with the expression of a man being surprised against his will. Well, the doctor said, sitting back and removing the stethoscope from his ears with deliberate care. "I will be honest with you, Conroy. I did not expect this much improvement this quickly." Grant looked at Eliza, who was standing in the doorway with her arms folded in the comfortable manner she had developed when dealing with this room, and something in his eyes was bright and complicated. "I've had good care," he said. "You've had excellent care," Pemberton agreed, nodding at Eliza. "Miss Hawthorne, whatever you've been doing, it's working considerably better than I'd hoped." "He's been following instructions," Eliza said, which made Grant's expression shift into something that was not quite a smile but was making efforts in that direction. "That alone is a miracle," Pemberton said, packing up his bag. "I would still recommend at least another week of limited activity. The lung is healing, but it is not healed. Gentle movement, short walks within the house and yard, nothing strenuous." He looked at Grant. "And I mean nothing strenuous, Grant. No horses, no fence mending, no cattle drives." "Understood," Grant said, with a restraint that Eliza recognized as costing him something. After Pemberton left, there was a quality to the afternoon that was different from the others. She could feel it when she came back into the room with the afternoon tray, a slight shift in the atmosphere, something newly unsettled. "He said another week," Grant said. "He did. That's not 4 weeks. No, you responded to treatment better than anticipated." She set the tray down. "You should be glad." "I am glad," he said, and then after a pause that had weight to it, "and I'm not glad, which is, I recognize that makes no sense." She sat down in the chair that had become hers by now in all but official designation, and she looked at him, and she let the pause continue rather than fill it with something easy. "It makes sense," she said eventually. It has had a particular quality, the time in here." She stopped because she was approaching the edge of something she had not planned to approach. "You'll leave," he said. It was not accusatory, simply factual, the way he spoke most things, but the simplicity of it had a texture that she felt. "When my services are no longer medically necessary, yes," she said. "That is the nature of the position." He looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was doing extraordinary things to the copper rocks, turning them a deep, burnished amber that shaded to almost purple at the ridgeline. It was the kind of afternoon that reminded you that the world was enormous and beautiful, and that human arrangements were, ultimately, smaller than the landscape they were made against. "I don't want you to," he said. Simply, quietly. With the directness that she had come to understand was just how he was, he did not say things sideways, did not approach feelings from the angle. She felt something move through her chest that was warm and frightening in equal measure, the way warmth in the chest is always at least a little frightening when you have not allowed yourself to feel it for a long time. "Grant," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both heard it. He looked at her. She stopped, ordered herself, began again. I have kept my feelings very organized for a long time, since my father died, before that even." She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap with a precision that was pure habit. "I came to this territory with the intention of working and moving, and not staying anywhere long enough to feel the leaving of it. And now," he said. She looked up at him. "And now I am sitting in this room and I have read you half the natural history of the Sonoran Desert, and I have argued with you about ledgers and dictated letters for you and watched you watch your horses in the morning, and I find that I am considerably less organized than I intended to be." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. His face did not lend itself to easy smiling, but the thing that lived in the same neighborhood. "That might be the most complicated way anyone has ever told me they have feelings. I'm a complicated person," she said, and this time she did smile briefly before catching it. "I know," he said. "I like it." They looked at each other in the amber afternoon light, and the unsettled thing between them was no longer unsettled but was not yet settled either, hovering in that particular in-between that is the most alive and terrifying place a person can occupy. "You should rest," she said, because there was nothing else to say right now that would not require more courage than she had assembled today. "I know," he said again, and he leaned his head back against the pillows and closed his eyes, and she sat in her chair and read her book and read none of it, and the afternoon turned slowly into evening. The following days were a different kind of difficulty. He was improving rapidly, noticeably, in ways that made her genuinely proud of him even as they moved her closer to the edge of necessity. He was sitting up for longer periods. He was taking short walks in the yard, just to the corral and back, leaning on nothing, breathing carefully but breathing well. The crackling in his lung was almost gone. His temperature was normal. His color was that of a healthy man. On the 17th day, Pablo came to tell her there was a visitor at the gate. A woman on horseback, well-dressed by territory standards, with dark hair and a cool, assessing expression. Her name was Catherine Hollies, and she was the daughter of James Hollies, who owned the second largest ranch in the county, and she had come, she said, to call on Mr. Conroy. Eliza showed her in with the professional neutrality she was very good at projecting, and she went to tell Grant he had a visitor, and she watched his face do the thing faces do when the person being mentioned is someone from a complicated history. "Catherine Hollies," he said, with a flatness that told her something. "Yes." "Should I tell her you're not receiving visitors?" "No," he said, after a brief internal battle she could see plainly on his face. "It would be rude. Send her in." She sent Catherine Hollies in and took herself to the kitchen, where she sat at the table and was extremely professional about not listening to the conversation down the hall. She did not entirely succeed, because the walls of an adobe house are not constructed with eavesdropping prevention in mind, and she heard enough to understand that Catherine Hollies had, at some point in the recent or not so recent past, expected that she and Grant Conroy might marry, and that this expectation had not been mutual in any lasting way, and that the conversation was courteous and careful in the way of conversations between people who have unfinished business they are both choosing to leave unfinished. Catherine Hollies left 30 minutes later. She stopped in the kitchen doorway briefly, looked at Eliza with an expression that was too controlled to read cleanly, and said, "He seems much improved. You've done good work, Miss Hawthorne." "Thank you," Eliza said. "He's a stubborn man," Catherine said. "Everything with him is the ranch. It's always been the ranch." She paused. I hope someone can find room in all that stubbornness." She left without further elaboration, and Eliza heard her horse's hooves in the yard, and then the silence of the afternoon. She went back to Grant's room. He was looking at the ceiling with an expression she had learned to read as the aftermath of a complicated feeling. "Are you all right?" she asked. "She wanted to marry me," he said. 2 years ago she made it very plain that she expected it. I couldn't tell her why I couldn't, because the why was something I didn't have clear in my own head until recently." "Until recently," Eliza said. She sat down in her chair because standing seemed like the wrong geography for this conversation. "A person can do everything right," he said, "and still know that the right person has not arrived yet. That sounds like a thing a man says to spare a woman's feelings and not mean it, but I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said quietly. "You don't say things you don't mean." He turned his head and looked at her with a directness that she felt through the whole length of her. "No," he agreed. "I don't." She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. "Grant, I want to be clear with you about something. I am not a woman who can simply take up a settled life without knowing what I am settling into. I have moved 4 times in 3 years, and I have become quite self-sufficient, and I have done that deliberately because I did not want the kind of hurt that comes from leaving the wrong thing, or worse, staying in the wrong thing." "I understand," he said. "But I also recognize," she continued, because she had started and she was going to finish, "that there is a difference between caution and fear, and I have been confusing them." He was very still, watching her with those gray-green eyes. "I have a week left here, by Pemberton's estimate," she said. "And I think perhaps we should spend that week more honestly than we've been spending it." "More honestly," he repeated, and the quiet warmth in his voice was something she was going to have to stop being surprised by every time she heard it. Yes, she said. He smiled then. The real kind, the kind that rearranged his whole face into something unexpectedly beautiful. I think I can manage that. She smiled back, and this time she did not catch it. The next morning she walked out with him to the corral, because Dr. Pemberton had approved short outdoor walks, and because it was a brilliant October morning with the kind of clear, sharp light that the desert produces after a cold night, the air carrying the smell of sage and horse and somewhere distant, mesquite smoke. He moved carefully, his hand not quite touching her arm but close enough that she was aware of every inch of that proximity. And she was aware of him looking at her, looking at the horses, with an expression she did not turn to see but felt anyway. He introduced her properly to the black mare, Ringo showing her the hand presentation approach, and the mare snuffled at Eliza's palm with enormous soft nostrils, and she laughed briefly, the involuntary kind. "You don't laugh much," he observed. "I don't always have cause," she said, still looking at the mare. "You should have more cause," he said, and it was so simply said that it landed in her chest without warning, the kind of sentence that does not announce itself as important before it becomes important. She looked at him. He was watching her with that steadiness, that patient, undramatic attention that she had realized was just how he looked at things he cared about: the land, his horses, the work, and now her, all receiving the same quality of regard, which was not cool but was quiet, the kind of warmth that lasts because it is not performed. "Grant," she said. "Eliza," he replied, and her name in his voice was a different thing than it was anywhere else. And she knew, standing in the morning light next to his black mare with the copper rocks watching them, that she was entirely lost, and that being lost in this particular way was not the same as being in danger. She took a step toward him, and he was already reaching, one hand coming to her face with a gentleness that was almost startling from a man of his size and general presence, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and she put her hand over his, and they stood there for a moment just like that, in the clear October morning, before she rose onto her toes and he came the rest of the way down, and their lips met in the most unhurried, gentle, absolutely certain kiss she had ever received in her life. When they separated, the mare snorted behind them, which broke the gravity of the moment into something lighter. "I believe your horse disapproves," Eliza said. "Ringo has strong opinions about everything," he said. His hand was still against her face, his thumb still making that small motion along her cheekbone, and he was looking at her with a kind of open wonder that she recognized because she was experiencing the same thing, the particular astonishment of a feeling that is larger than you made room for. "We should go back inside," she said. "You've been standing long enough." "Agreed," he said, and he did not argue, and they walked back to the house in the bright morning, close enough that their arms brushed with every step. Everything that came after had a different quality. The last week of her official tenure was the best week of her life in Copper Bend, and possibly, she thought privately, one of the best weeks of her life in any benchmark. They talked in the evenings with the genuine engagement of two people discovering that the other person's mind is exactly as interesting as they had hoped. He told her about the years building the ranch, the droughts and the cattle losses, and the season when the grass fires came within half a mile of the house, and he and Pablo fought them back with wet blankets and improvised fire breaks. She told him about her years in Missouri, the long rides with her father to reach patients 30 miles out, the women she had helped through difficult births, the man she had watched die of something that a proper hospital in a city could have cured. "Have you ever wanted to go to a city?" he asked. "I have thought about it," she said honestly. "There are hospitals in St. Louis in Denver where a woman with medical knowledge could work and learn in a way that's not possible out here." She paused. "But I look out at this desert and I think this is where the need is. The cities have doctors. Out here, people ride 4 hours to reach the nearest physician, and sometimes that ride is too long." "So you stay in places like this," he said. "I keep moving through places like this," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" he said, and it was not a challenge but a genuine question, and she heard in it the thing he was not saying directly, which was asking whether staying in one of these places might be possible, whether staying in this place specifically might be possible. She did not answer it that night. But she thought about it through the night, lying in her small room with the desert wind pushing at the window, the moon enormous over the copper rocks, and she thought about what it would mean, what staying would require, what she would need to believe to stay, and in the morning she had not reached a conclusion, but she was no longer running from the question. On the 21st day, Dr. Pemberton arrived for his weekly visit and declared Grant Conroy, with a degree of bewilderment he did not bother to conceal, largely recovered. The lung was clear. The ribs were healed. His temperature was normal, his color excellent, his general constitution, Pemberton said, better than it had been when the doctor had first examined him after the fall. "I have honestly never seen a recovery this complete at this speed," Pemberton said, packing up his bag in the sitting room with Eliza while Grant dressed in the bedroom with the restored dignity of a man resuming his proper life. "You should be proud, Miss Hawthorne. Whatever methods you used, they worked." "I followed sound medical practice and made sure he followed it as well," she said. "He told me you argued with him every single day." "I did. He was wrong most of those days." Pemberton laughed, the genuine kind. "You're wasted as a private nurse, you know. You should be in a proper medical practice." "Perhaps someday," she said. "Is there—" He hesitated in the way of a man choosing whether to be direct or tactful and choosing direct. "Is there reason to believe you might stay in Copper Bend, Miss Hawthorne?" "I ask because I have been the only physician for 40 miles in any direction for 12 years, and I am 61 years old and my knees are not what they were, and a woman of your skill would be the community would benefit considerably." She looked at him. "Is that a professional inquiry, Dr. Pemberton?" "It is a professional inquiry that I suspect has some personal relevance as well," he said, with the benign perceptiveness of an older man who had watched the world long enough to see clearly. "Though I promise I am asking about it professionally first." "I will think about it," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. Grant came out of the bedroom fully dressed for the first time in 3 weeks, in dark trousers and a chambray shirt and his boots, and he looked so thoroughly himself, so entirely the man this ranch required, solid and present and fitting the space he occupied, that it knocked something loose in Eliza's chest. He shook Pemberton's hand. He saw Pemberton to the door. He came back into the sitting room where Eliza was standing with her hands folded, her medical satchel at her feet, and they looked at each other in the clear morning light. "So," she said. "So," he agreed. "You're recovered. It appears so. Faster than anyone expected." "Faster than I expected," he said, and then quietly, "not faster than I hoped, because I knew what it meant when I recovered." She looked at her satchel. She looked at him. She made the decision without drama, without the careful weighing she usually applied to everything, the way she had made the decision to come here in the first place, with something deeper than logic. "I spoke with Dr. Pemberton," she said. "I heard a little of it. He suggested I might stay in Copper Bend in a professional capacity." "He's not wrong that the town needs medical help," Grant said, and he was watching her with that careful steadiness, not pushing, not retracting, simply being what he was and letting her decide. "No, he's not wrong," she said. "And I was thinking about what you said, about doing everything alone, about being tired of it." She took a breath. "I am tired of it too. I have been tired of it since my father died, and I kept moving so I didn't have to be still long enough to feel the tiredness of it." He crossed the room slowly, giving her every chance to step back or step sideways or change the subject, and she did none of those things. He stopped close enough that she could see the texture of his shirt and the line of his jaw and the steady gray-green of his eyes. "Stay," he said, simply. "I'm thinking about it very seriously," she said, which, given who she was and how much she did not say things she did not mean, was essentially a yes, and he knew it, and she knew that he knew it. He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the sitting room of his house in the morning light, and it was a different kind of kiss than the one by the corral. That one had been wonder. This one was something decided, deliberate, the kind of kiss that means something is beginning rather than discovering. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her with a warmth she was learning to stop being surprised by. "There is a second bedroom," he said, "past yours down the hall. My mother used to use it as a sitting room. It has a south window that gets good light all day and a desk that's not being used." He paused. "It would make a reasonable medical office if a person wanted one." She considered this. "You're offering me a medical office." "I am offering whatever makes it easier for you to stay," he said, with a directness that was so characteristic of him that she found it entirely endearing. "That would be most men's approach to courting," she said. "I'm not most men." "No," she said softly, "you very much are not." November came in over the territory with cold blue skies and the first real bite of winter, and Eliza Hawthorne stayed. She sent a letter to the boarding house in Tucson requesting her remaining belongings be forwarded, and she wrote to the few contacts she had in Missouri to inform them of her new situation. And she did not second-guess herself, which was new, and she discovered that not second-guessing yourself felt remarkably like breathing without difficulty. She arranged the south-facing room into an office and examination room, and she spread the word through Pablo and through Deputy Hayes that medical services were available at the Conroy Ranch for those who could not make the journey to town to see Dr. Pemberton. Within the first 2 weeks, 3 families had come: a woman from the neighboring property with a child who had a badly infected ear, an elderly man from town who had been unable to make the journey to Pemberton with his rheumatic joints, and a young vaquero from the Miller Ranch who had cut his arm badly on barbed wire and needed proper stitching. She was busy, and she was useful, and those 2 things together made a life she had been building toward without quite knowing it. Grant moved back into the full running of the ranch with the contained energy of a man who had been held back too long, but he moved into it differently than he had before, Eliza noticed. He still worked from before sunrise to after dark, still rode every pasture and knew every animal, and was present in the way that a ranch of that size required. But he came home. Before he had been going through the motions of a man who did not quite believe there was anything different about being inside versus being outside, one more task in an endless series of tasks. Now he came home at the end of the day, and there was a pointedness to it, a direction. He brought her wildflowers once in early November, the kind of small, tough desert flowers that bloomed in the cold between the rocks, and she stood in the kitchen doorway with her apron on and a flower-covered hand, and she looked at him holding them, and something about the image, this massive, composed, serious man holding a small bunch of desert flowers with the same care he gave everything that mattered, made her feel a warmth so pervasive and so absolute that she simply opened her arms and he walked into them, and they stood there in the kitchen doorway in the last of the afternoon light, her face against his chest, his chin against her hair, his arms around her with a gentleness that somehow contained everything. "You are a very surprising man," she said into his shirt. "You've mentioned that," he said. "I suspect I will continue to mention it." "I suspect I won't mind," he said. December arrived. The territory cold was serious now, the nights dropping below freezing, the desert acquiring a spare, crystalline beauty that was entirely its own. She had been here 2 months, which was longer than she had stayed anywhere in 3 years, and she felt it in her bones differently than she expected, not like confinement but like choosing, the active verb of it, choosing to be in this exact place. It was on a Thursday evening in early December, with snow on the distant peaks and the fire built high in the sitting room and the smell of Pablo's supper coming from the kitchen, that Grant came in from the cold with his coat still on and stopped in the doorway of the sitting room where she was reading, and looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the one he wore when he had decided something. She had learned that look. It was distinct from the ordinary focus he gave things. It was the expression of a man who has assembled himself around a purpose, "I want to ask you something," he said. She put down her book and gave him her full attention, which was her way of showing care, not warm words but the complete gift of focus. He came and sat beside her on the bench, not across from her but beside her close, and he looked at his hands for a moment and then at her face. "I know you didn't come here intending to stay," he said. "I know you came here for a job and you had a plan that involved moving. I know you are not a woman who makes decisions easily or quickly, and I respect that entirely. I do not want you to think I'm asking this to push you towards something before you're ready." He stopped. "Grant," she said. "I'm trying to get to the asking part," he said with a slight roughness. "I know, I'm letting you get there. I'm just letting you know I'm listening." He looked at her. "Eliza Hawthorne," he said, and her name in his voice was still that other thing, that different register that belonged specifically to him. "I have been alone on this land for 8 years, and I have built everything worth building except the one thing that would make any of it matter past my own lifetime, which is a family. Someone to give it to. Someone to build it with." He paused. "I have never said that out loud before." "I know," she said softly. "You came here to nurse a dying man," he said. "I appreciate the irony that I am not dying, that you got me better faster than either of us expected, and that the result of that is that you are sitting here in December in my sitting room and I am asking you to marry me." She held very still, which was not from hesitation but from the need to let the thing settle into her properly, to receive it with the fullness it deserved. "There is a lot I would have to consider," she said. "My work. I won't stop my medical work." "I know." "I already talked to Pemberton about it." She blinked. "You talked to Pemberton?" "I told him that if you were willing to marry me, I would fund a proper medical room with proper equipment, and that you would continue to practice as you see fit, and that I had no interest in a wife who was less than the full version of herself." He paused. He said that was the most sensible thing he'd heard in years. She felt something fill up in her chest that was not just warmth but the particular and rare feeling of being entirely and correctly understood, of someone having looked at you and seen not what they wanted you to be but what you were, and having wanted that. "I am not always easy to live with," she said. "I have strong opinions." "I noticed," he said with the faint warmth that was his version of a smile. "I will argue with you when I believe I am right, which is frequently. I noticed that as well. I don't mind being argued with by someone who knows what they're talking about." She stopped. "Grant, I want you to understand what you're asking. I'm not the kind of woman who becomes the lesser half of something." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking for that. I am asking you to be the full person you are here, with me. Because I believe we are considerably better as both of us than either of us is alone. And because I have been more myself in the last 2 months than I have been in 8 years. He met her eyes direct and certain. "I love you. That is the plain form of all of this." The plainness of it, the simple declaration without embellishment, without the performance some men put into such statements. It was so absolutely him that she felt it everywhere. "I love you too," she said. "That is the plain form of the last 2 months for me as well." He reached over and took her hand, and she looked down at their hands together, her long medical hands and his broad rancher's hands, and she thought that this was the picture of it, right here, 2 different kinds of strength figuring out how to hold the same thing. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of a man who has expected resistance so long that its absence needs a moment to register as real. Then he exhaled, a quiet, full breath, and lifted her hand, and pressed it briefly against his mouth with a tenderness that she felt in her sternum. "I'll speak to Hayes tomorrow," he said. "He's also the justice of the peace." "Of course he is," she said, and the laugh came out warm and unguarded, and he was smiling at her, the full real version, and they stayed there by the fire while the December wind pushed at the windows, and the territory settled into its cold and beautiful winter around them. They married on the 23rd of December, 1882, which was 10 weeks after Eliza Hawthorne stepped off the mail coach in Copper Bend with her medical satchel, and a practical expectation of staying for a month. The ceremony was held in the Conroy sitting room because it was cold, and because neither of them was interested in performance, and the witnesses were Marcus Hayes, Pablo Reyes, and Dr. Pemberton, and Pablo had cooked the meal, and it was the best meal Eliza had eaten in years. She wore her green dress, which was the only one she owned with any ceremony to it, and she had done her hair up carefully in the way her mother had taught her, and Grant stood in a clean dark suit that had come from the back of his wardrobe where it had been since his father's funeral, and he looked at her when she came down the hall and into the sitting room, and his face did the thing it did, the thing that was entirely his own version of emotion, quiet and deep and utterly without pretense. Hayes read the words. Grant said them with the same directness he gave everything that mattered. Eliza said them with a steadiness she had earned, the steadiness of someone who has weighed a thing properly and chosen it freely. When Hayes pronounced them married and told Grant he could kiss his bride, Grant looked at her and she looked at him, and they both appreciated, without saying it, that this sentence implied a whole series of assumptions about whose initiative this was, and then Grant said, very quietly, "May I?" And she stepped forward herself and kissed him, and Hayes laughed, and Pablo made a sound of approval, and Dr. Pemberton beamed in the way of a man who has recognized a good outcome. January came, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms, and Eliza's days had a shape she had never had before, full and varied. The mornings belonging to the medical room where she treated whomever came, and the afternoons and evenings belonging to the ranch and to him, and to the slowly deepening understanding of what their shared life was going to be. She learned the land. She went out with him on the milder days, riding alongside him on a bay mare named Jessie because, of course, Ringo's last pasture mate, and he showed her the ranch the way he knew it, not just as property but as place, the way the light moved across it across a day, where the natural springs were, where the grass grew thickest, which pastures flooded in the spring runoff and which were reliable year-round. She absorbed it the way she absorbed information about the human body, with the sense that understanding a thing correctly was both an intellectual and a moral obligation. She learned about him in the quieter ways, the details that are invisible until you live alongside someone. He was an early riser, always before dawn, and he made the coffee himself with the particular care of someone for whom coffee in the dark was a private ritual. He was better with animals than with most people, not from misanthropy but from patience. He had the same quality with animals that he had with her, the willingness to be still and let things come to him, which was the rarest quality in a person and possibly the most valuable. He kept a small journal that he wrote in most evenings, brief entries, practical notes about the ranch interleaved with occasional observations about the world that were quietly perceptive. And when she found this out, she told him she had not taken him for a writer, and he said he was not a writer. He just preferred to put things down before he lost them. She told him about her own writing, the medical journals she kept, and he asked to read one, and she gave him the least technical, and he read it carefully and handed it back and said, "You're very good at this," meaning not the medicine but the writing, and she had not expected that to matter as much as it did. In February, she established that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, the same unglamorous Tuesday quality to it as when the telegram had first arrived, because life rarely arranged its important moments in dramatic settings. She simply told him, standing by the stove with her coffee cup in her hands, that they were going to have a child, and she watched his face do the most remarkable thing, the complete dissolution of his usual composure into something utterly open and astonished and luminous. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her and said nothing for a long moment, and she felt the breath go out of him against her hair, slow and complete, like a man setting something down that he has been carrying since before he knew he was carrying it. "Are you all right?" he said eventually. "Are you is everything. I am perfectly well," she said. "I am a medical professional. I know exactly what this requires, and I will take excellent care of myself and the baby, And if you are going to turn into the kind of man who frets over his wife at every turn, I need to know immediately so I can establish ground rules." He made a sound that was a laugh. "Ground rules. Very clear ones. What are the ground rules? I will manage my own health and I will tell you if I need anything, and you must trust me to know when I need something, rather than assuming I need something at all times." "That seems reasonable," he said. He was still holding her and she had not moved out of it, which said more than the ground rules. "What else?" "I will continue to practice medicine for as long as it is safe to do so, which will be quite some time. I will not be wrapped in cotton wool." "Wouldn't dare," he said. "And when the baby comes, we will discuss the work arrangement and be flexible and adult about it, rather than assuming one of us has to give up our responsibilities entirely." "Already agreed," he said. She leaned her head back against his shoulder. Outside, the February territory was cold and pale and quiet. The copper rocks were the color of old rust in the morning light. Somewhere in the direction of the barn, she could hear Pablo singing off-key to himself while he worked, which was a sound she had become deeply fond of over the months. "I did not know," she said, "when I came here that this was what waiting for me." "Nor did I," he said. "I am very glad the lung took as long as it did," she said. "So am I," he said, "specifically the part where it required nursing. Extremely specific gratitude. I am an extremely specific person." She laughed, genuine and warm, and he held her a little tighter, and the morning sat around them with the quiet satisfaction of a story finding its shape. Spring came to the Arizona territory with the extravagance it reserved for the desert. Everything that had appeared dead or dormant erupting into bloom and life, with the suddenness of something that had been accumulating beneath the surface all winter, waiting for the exact right moment. The saguaro bloomed white at their crowns. The palo verde trees went yellow gold. The air smelled of rain and sage, and the particular sweetness of desert flowers that bloomed for just a few weeks and had to make every day count. Eliza's medical practice had grown substantially by spring. Dr. Pemberton had, as he had hinted, begun to step back from the most physically demanding visits, and the community had begun to make the journey to the Conroy Ranch with a regularity that required her to formalize her hours and expand the equipment she kept. Grant, true to his word, had funded the proper fitting out of the medical room with equipment from the supplier in Prescott, a proper examination table, a full medicine cabinet, the good lamp, and she had organized it with the precision and care she gave to everything she valued. She had also, quietly and with Grant's support, begun something larger. She had written letters to the Tohono O'odham community 8 miles east, through Miguel, the man Grant had mentioned, and with careful and respectful approach had opened a conversation about whether she might visit, whether medical care might be welcomed in a community that had been systematically excluded from the resources that were available to the white settlers. It was a slow and rightly cautious conversation. She understood completely why a government doctor would not be trusted, but Miguel was a careful man with a long memory for what happened when outsiders offered things, and she had earned a degree of trust over several months of demonstrated honesty and direct dealing. And in the spring, she had made her first visit. It was one of the most important things she had done in her professional life. Not the most dramatic, not the most technically complex, but the most important because it was the most needed and the most right. And she came home from that first visit with her satchel worn and her heart full and found Grant waiting at the kitchen door. "How was it?" he asked. "There are children with conditions that have gone untreated for years," she said, "because there was no one who would come who would also treat them with dignity." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "How often do you need to go?" "Monthly at minimum, more if there is acute illness." "Take Pablo with you," he said. "He knows the territory between here and there and he has a good head in a situation. And take the good horse." She looked at him. "You approve?" "Of course I approve," he said. "It's the right thing to do." She reached up and touched his face briefly and deliberately, and he turned into it in the way he had, the small private gesture of a man who was not demonstrative in general company but was thoroughly and completely affectionate in the privacy of his own home, and she loved him for it, the completeness of it. The baby came in October. A boy, which felt appropriately symmetrical with the season, and the year, and the way things had been circling around to their right places since the autumn before. Grant was beside her through the long hours of it, holding her hand with the still, steadying presence that was so essentially him, not filling the room with noise and anxiety, but simply being there in the way that mattered. And Dr. Pemberton delivered the child with the quiet competence of a man who had been doing this for decades. They named him James Samuel Conroy. James for Grant's father, Samuel for hers. Grant held the baby in the way of a man who has spent his life handling things that require care, firmly enough to be safe, gently enough to honor the fragility, and he looked down at the boy with an expression Eliza had not seen before on his face, something new, something that had no word she could find that was quite large enough. "James Samuel," he said quietly, "welcome to the Conroy Ranch." The baby made the sound that babies make, small and peremptory, and not particularly concerned with the weight of the moment, and both of them laughed, and the room was full of something that was not happiness exactly, but was larger than happiness, the thing that contains happiness within it along with everything else, all the years that had led here and all the years that would come after, the whole unfolding life of it. Pablo came in the next morning with a bunch of desert flowers and his hat in his hands and his eyes very bright, and he stood at the door of the room and looked at the baby and said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "He looks like his father." "He looks like a very small, bald, extremely opinionated person," Eliza said, from the bed where she was sitting up with the baby and her coffee, because she had been clear with everyone that she was not an invalid and did not intend to be treated as one, and Grant had made sure the coffee appeared. "That is definitely his father," Pablo confirmed, and Grant made a sound of protest that neither of them took seriously. The first year of James's life was full in the way that a life with a child and a ranch and a medical practice and a marriage between two strong-willed people is full. Not always easy, frequently complicated, occasionally the site of genuine disagreement, and relentlessly alive. She and Grant argued sometimes, properly argued, about the management of her time and his, and the ranch's needs and the community's needs, and neither of them conceded points they didn't believe, and both of them had learned that the arguing was not a problem, but a sign that they were both entirely present, and that the coming back to each other afterward was its own particular pleasure. She expanded the medical practice to include a proper schedule of visits, twice monthly to the Tohono O'odham community, weekly hours at the ranch for general community patients, and once a month, a visit to town in partnership with Dr. Pemberton, who was, by the end of 1883, cutting back his practice substantially and relying on her as the primary medical presence for the outlying areas. When he proposed formally that she take over the practice, she accepted with the straightforward satisfaction of someone who has been building toward a thing without naming it as a goal. Deputy Hayes, who had by now become something of a family friend in the way that people in small communities accumulate around each other, made a point of visiting regularly and brought news, and occasionally brought problems that benefited from being talked through with people who thought clearly. And these visits had the comfortable quality of an extended family that is not formally constituted, but is real in every meaningful way. In the spring of 1884, Eliza found herself expecting again. She told Grant on a Saturday morning while they were both in the kitchen, which was the same unglamorous venue as before, and seemed to be their setting for important news, and he responded with the same astonishing openness he had shown the first time. And James, who was 6 months old and had opinions about everything, observed this display of parental emotion with the tolerant expression of someone too young to be embarrassed by it but well on the way. "A brother or sister for James," Grant said. Most likely, Eliza said. Statistics favor it. I would like a daughter, he said, which was the first time either of them had stated a preference. Daughters are wonderful, she agreed. I was one. The best kind, he said, and kissed her over the baby's head. The second child arrived in December of 1884, a girl, which Grant received with the particular expression of a man who has stated a wish and received it, and is a little stunned by the straightforwardness of the universe on this occasion. They named her Frances Margaret Conroy Frances for no one in particular, a name Eliza had always liked, and Margaret for Grant's mother. Margaret Conroy had been a woman who had come to the territory at 20 years old with her husband, and had made this land into something, who had grown flowers in the desert and kept chickens, and raised a son who grew up knowing that stubbornness well-directed was a virtue. And Eliza had heard enough about her to understand that naming her granddaughter Margaret was not just sentiment but acknowledgement. Frances was dark-haired like her father and had her mother's eyes, the warm brown of them, and she was, from the beginning, inclined toward everything at once, curious about all of it, reaching for whatever was nearest with both hands. James, as he grew into the toddler stage, regarded his sister with the philosophical attitude of someone who had not asked for a companion, but was open to the possibility. Life at the Conroy Ranch in the years following settled into the particular richness of a thing that has been correctly made. Grant's ranch continued to grow. He bought the adjacent land parcel in 1885 when the original claim holder moved east, and the expansion brought new hands and new responsibilities that he managed with the competent authority that was his natural register. Eliza's practice became formally the most relied-upon medical resource in the area, and when a hospital was proposed for the county seat in 1886, she was one of the people whose name was put forward for the medical board, which she accepted on the condition that it include representation from communities that had historically been excluded. She and Miguel's community maintained the relationship she had built with care over 3 years, and it was not simple. The history was too old and too deep for simplicity, but it was genuine, and it contributed to something slightly better than what had been there before, and she had learned to value the incremental over the dramatic. On an evening in the autumn of 1886, 4 years after the telegram that had brought her here, Eliza sat on the porch of the house she now entirely thought of as her own, watching the sun go down over the copper rocks and turn the sky all the colors the desert sky knows how to be: amber and rose and deep violet, and the particular clear blue-gray of the high atmosphere at dusk. James was 3 and asleep inside. Frances was 2 and also asleep, which had required more effort and was a victory. Pablo had gone to visit his family in Tucson for the week, and the ranch was quiet in the way it got in his absence, slightly less warm around the edges. Grant came out and sat beside her on the porch bench, close, his shoulder against hers in the comfortable manner they had both settled into over 4 years of marriage, and he looked at the same sky she was looking at, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I was thinking about the day you arrived," she said eventually. "Which day was that exactly?" "The day you said no to me before I even set my bag down." "I said no to the general concept of nurses," he said, with that voice quality. "And here we are," she said. "Here we are," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her in the simple, unconsidered way of a man for whom this gesture had become as natural as breathing, and she felt the warmth of him against the cool evening air and looked at the sky doing its extraordinary things and thought about all of it: the telegram, the mail coach, the terrible stubbornness of him in those first days, the way the conversations had moved toward honesty, the morning by the corral, the December sitting room, the babies, the work. All of it threading back to that October arrival with her satchel and her practical intentions and her heart that had been closed for long enough. "Do you ever think," she said, "about how differently it could have gone? If you'd been better at accepting help, if you'd driven me away like the others?" "Sometimes," he said, "and then I stop thinking about it because it's not useful and it makes me feel like I need to go for a long ride," she laughed, very pragmatic. "I've been told," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I am glad," she said, "that you were difficult and that you were also eventually not impossible." "The bar," he said. "The bar cleared," she told him. Significantly. He pressed a kiss to her hair, unhurried and certain, and she closed her eyes for a moment and let the evening and the land and the life settle around her like something that had been waiting to be inhabited and had found, at last, the right person. The copper rocks caught the last of the sun and held it briefly, luminous and warm and impossibly beautiful against the darkening sky. And then the light went and the stars came, as they always did, with the extravagance the Arizona night reserved for the clear desert air, more stars than a Missouri girl had known existed, filling the sky from edge to edge with the particular generosity of a universe that is, in the end, larger than any of the stories we tell about it. But this story, this particular, specific, unlikely story that had begun with a telegram and a dying man who refused to die and a woman who had come to nurse and had stayed to love, this story was whole. She had been hired to nurse a dying rancher back to health. He had gotten better faster than either of them expected. And everything else, all of it, every argument and every morning and every honest word and every child's name and every ride across copper-colored land and every kiss in every ordinary kitchen, all of it had come from that, from the simple and improbable fact that he had healed, and she had stayed, and they had found in each other the exact company that the long work of a life requires. The night deepened and the stars held steady, and the ranch settled into its quiet, and inside the house James slept the uncomplicated sleep of a child who does not yet know that the world is difficult, and Frances slept with her small fists curled beside her face, and on the porch Eliza and Grant sat in the late autumn dark and did not need to say anything at all, because some things are complete without words, and theirs was one of them.